As George and Martha Washington, they have been given interesting, informative, and entertaining talks and appearances traveling throughout the United States. Bill is a member of the Daytona, Ormond chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution, and Cara belongs to the Colonel Arthur Irwin chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution located in DeLand. Welcome and thank you for coming.
I was born February 11th, 1732, under the Julian calendar, along Post Creek, not far from the Potomac. In my youth, I moved twice, but spent most of my youth at a place called Ferry Farm along the banks of the Rappahannock across from the village of Fredericksburg. When I turned 11 years of age, my father passed, and with his passing, I was to inherit that Ferry Farm as well as 10 slaves. Of course, my mother would hold them for me in trust until I would come of age. But you must know she was very strict and demanding, and she never remarried. Fortunately, I came across my father's surveying equipment and took an interest in it, became somewhat self-taught. It became invaluable to me throughout my life. But about that same time, my mother told me that I could go visit my two older half-brothers at their inheritances. Inherited, you know what I mean. The youngest was Augustine, and he inherited my birthplace along Post Creek. The oldest, Lawrence, of course, got the largest tract of land along Little Honey Creek, overlooking the Potomac. And I must say that I enjoyed visiting both of them. However, I had visited Lawrence and Anne far more, as it turned out. They certainly intrigued me. She was a Fairfax. And you know, the Fairfaxes were one of the wealthiest families in all of Virginia and lived right next to Lawrence at Bellevue Plantation. And anytime I visited them, I enjoyed hearing his stories about service in the Virginia Regiment, especially when he was with the Royal Navy at the Battle of Cartagena down in the Caribbean. Well, in my youth, I did court several young ladies, but most were just passing acquaintances, I must admit. But one in particular, Miss Mary Carey, certainly had a special attraction for her. She was the youngest sister of my best friend, George William Fairfax, that would be Sally. But her father soon put an end to my courting her. He did not see me as a man of any wealth.
My home was Chestnut Grove Plantation, and it just happened to be up the Pamunkey River from the home of my first husband, Daniel Custis. I married Daniel when I was almost 19. He was almost 40. Daniel was one of the wealthiest plantation owners in all of Virginia. His wealth came from tobacco. We made our home White House Plantation, which had 17,000 acres and 300 slaves. My marriage to Daniel moved me to the upper class of Virginia society. We had 4 children, but only 2 lived past the age of 4, my Jackie and Patsy. Daniel died of a severe throat ailment in 1757 after only 7 years of marriage, and he left me to be the wealthiest widow in all of Virginia.
Country with the Fairfax family, I learned my oldest half brother, Lawrence, was quite ill. He had consumption, some called it tuberculosis. The Fairfaxes recommended that he should go to the Caribbean, to the island of Barbados. There was a doctor there that they knew that had success working with those ailments. Well, his wife Anne had just given birth to their daughter Sarah, and she was in no condition to travel. So I agreed to accompany him to Barbados. It'd be the only time I'd leave America in my life. Once there, I was so taken with the tropical fauna and the tropical climate that after about 3 weeks, I contracted that dreaded disease, smallpox. I was fortunate, I had a good doctor attend to me, and after several weeks, I only had a few pockmarks left on my face. Now I can't wait to get on the first ship and make my way back to Virginia. Lawrence was going to stay behind, though, in the Caribbean, as he was having success with his ailment. But he also returned in about 3 months, only to pass. He was 34. Well, with this passing, you know, his wife Anne, as we customarily do in the day, she soon remarried and moved out of Mount Vernon. I was able to lease Mount Vernon from her. With her early demise, I inherited Mount Vernon. I also inherited Lawrence's commission, though, in the Virginia Regiment as Governor Dinwiddie, maybe an adjutant with the rank of major.
When he died, I mourned, but knew I had to find another husband quickly. Upon his death, I instantly became a businesswoman. You see, he died without a will, and he hadn't appointed a guardian to take over the business affairs of the plantation. So I had to do it, and I had to start immediately. While deep in mourning, I had to deal with tobacco brokers in England and overseers of the plantation. I was prepared and I was quite capable, but there were many who said I was uneducated, not having a formal education. But I did have a good education. My mother was my teacher, and she raised me to be a fine lady in Virginia society. She taught me how to read, how to write, how to dance, and how to run a proper household, which fortunately included how to run the business affairs of a large plantation. When I could no longer avoid the inevitable, I started taking my 2 children and going to visit local plantations for a couple days at a time. And on one visit, I was planning on visiting with Major Chamberlain and his family. Now, he, my father, and my late husband had all been vestrymen in St. Peter's Church. And I grew up with his daughters, and I attended many of the dinners and balls at their sprawling plantation Poplar Grove.
With the outbreak of that French and Indian War, it was truly the beginning of my military career. Governor Dinwiddie, through the war, gave me a commission of colonel. And during the war, Lord King sent over troops to our colonies. And the first one I was able to join up with was under General Braddock. I was with him until he was mortally wounded at the Battle of Monongahela. Then sometime after that, about 6,000 more troops were sent here by the King under General John Forbes. And again, he agreed I could join his forces as one of his advisors.
I was a widow for a little less than a year when I began to realize that being wealthy and having 2 small children put me in an awkward position. I had to allow myself time to grieve, but as a businesswoman, I had no time to find another husband. And finding another husband would be the only way I could go back to the job I really wanted, raising my 2 small children. Now, I had to outmaneuver some very unsavory matches. But I was courted by some quality gentlemen, one in particular, Charles Carter of Cleve. He was a member of the House of Burgess, and he was 20 years older than me. And really, the only thing wrong with that match, other than the fact that we were totally incompatible, was the fact that he already had 12 children, and I couldn't imagine raising his 12 and mine 2.
Shortly after joining up with General Forbes, I had to take a leave of absence from the Army because I became quite ill. I went directly to my personal physician in Williamsburg, and while there, I had to deliver a message to Governor Dinwiddie from the General. Now, I was going to head home to Mount Vernon for a time to recover. I decided to take the path along the Pamunkey River, and I soon spied a ferry slip, which I knew went across the river to the road which led up to the Chamberlain plantation. And then without any much thought at all in my mind, I wound up directing my horse onto the wooden public ferry and going on that road, and would soon be at Major Chamberlain's plantation.
I was as surprised as everyone that day when the very young, handsome Virginia militia officer, Colonel Washington then, arrived at the Chamberlains for a visit, unannounced, uninvited. Now, we had met previously when I was married to Daniel. We attended many of the same dinners and balls in Williamsburg. Now, when he entered the parlor that day, his stature and appearance were very impressive. He was very tall, and he stood ramrod straight. There were many among us who claimed that he carried himself regally. When he walked through the door that day, we were all also very concerned. He looked gaunt and like he didn't feel very well.
I must admit, as we were approaching the chambers, I was not feeling very noble or majestic indeed at all. But then again, I was just going to pay my respects and we'd be on our way home to Mount Vernon. I told my manservant that day, Bishop, he was given to me by General Braddock, I told him to tend to horses. I'll be back in a moment and we can be on our way. Well, got off my horse and headed up onto the porch to the door. I was exhausted. You understand, for about the past 6 months I've been suffering from a bout of dysentery. When the door opened, I saw where they had many guests. I didn't recognize any of them, but most of them seemed to know who I was. Major Chamberlain then took and led me about the room. He reintroduced me to the Lady Custis and her 2 children. You know, her husband Daniel and I, we had many common friends and attended many events together in Colonial Williamsburg, something galas indeed. We had much to talk about. Well, the other guests realized this and left us on our own. But before we knew it, the afternoon swiftly went by and we were being called to dinner.
After dinner, we continued our conversation, and I suggested to him some medicinal herbs and foods that might alleviate his chronic symptoms. I also shared with him the losses, the tragedies of my life, the loss of my 2 oldest children, the death of my father, and the most recent burial of my husband Daniel. I then explained to him the difficulty I was having running a very large plantation. And on that topic, he was most interested.
On that note, I realized we did have much in common and much to talk about, but I even shared the early demise of my father and my half-brother Lawrence with her. And I told her that I looked upon Lawrence as truly as my mentor in life. Anytime I visited him and his wife Anne and the Fairfaxes, they had great influence on me. I actually started studying geometry, art, music, dance, and even reading the classics. But they continually impressed upon me that I should keep working on my surveying skills.
He described to me the frustrations of living a military life, the controversy over the slain French diplomat, the debacle at Fort Necessity, and the tragic death of General Braddock. He then went on to tell me that he was most interested in getting into politics. He actually told me that he tried once and lost. Now, he was told that he lost because he didn't serve enough liquor on election day. Now, it was illegal to do so, but quite commonplace in Virginia. You see, we did have much to talk about.
I failed to realize that after dinner, as we continued our conversation, darkness started to settle in, and none of the guests were to be found. We surmised that they had gone off to their bedchambers or out in their carriages and headed home. About that time, Major Chamberlain and his wife came into the parlor and were seated. They told me I should plan on staying the night. It was much too dark, but too late to think of going home to Mount Vernon. They already told Bishop to stable the horses. Then they conveniently left the room. Well, we continued to talk, and if my memory serves me well, it wasn't until the last embers of the fire died down before we decided to separate and go to our separate chambers. After breakfast that morning, we got together once more time to continue our conversation, but I knew I was going to have to be on my way and get back to Mount Vernon, but not before I agreed to accept the invitation she extended to me to come visit her at a White House plantation in several weeks. You know, there seemed to be something special in our relationship. The next time I saw Martha was in March of 1758. Then I returned in May. She asked me to stay for several days. I accepted. As I got to know her better and drew a real fondness for her 2 children, I asked her to marry me. She accepted.
When he stopped for the extended visit in May, he rode our horses, played with the children, and talked constantly. On one particular occasion, we rode our horses out to a favorite grove of trees. We dismounted and began to walk. That's where he proposed. I was very relieved. And I was also very excited about all the possibilities. But it was then that he reminded me that he needed to return to General Forbes and the French and Indian conflict. I didn't see him again for many months.
I realized at age 27, I needed to settle down. I needed to marry. I needed a mistress at Mount Vernon. And after all, there was something that I actually liked about that Martha Custis, indeed. There was something charming about her that intrigued me. She'll be the love of my life, my domestic enjoyment. You know, marriage to me in part determines one's peace of the future. It's the most important event in one's life, the foundation of your happiness or your misery. Well, I ordered renovations to be completed at Mount Vernon for my impending family. Likewise, in July of that year, I wrote to my Martha and told her that I was going to be on the move as General Forbes was taking the army as we were headed for Fort Duquesne.
When he wrote to me, he said that he was extremely pleased that we had committed to each other, and he was praying constantly to divine providence to keep us both safe.
Made a decision that if we had any success on this campaign at Fort Duquesne, I was going to resign my commission and return to civilian life. I didn't have any future in the military, you understand. And after all, back in civilian life, I had something to look forward to, for sure. Indeed. Well, in December, after our victory at Fort Duquesne, I did indeed resign my commission, and I headed directly to her White House plantation. Once there, we proceeded to discuss our marriage plans. We chose January 6th, 12th night. Now, not only did I have that date to look forward to, but I learned while serving with General Forbes that I had been duly elected to be a member of the House of Burgesses. You know, I ran for that office one other time and lost. But now my good friends, Colonel James Woods and others, ran the campaign for me. And I hear there was much libation served on election day.
We were told that our marriage was the highlight of the Virginia social season. Both our friends and family alike were pleased with the match, and our marriage fit the tradition of gentry families marrying into gentry families. Now, since Christmas was a religious holiday, we instead chose 12th night, which was an English holiday celebrated around Christmas. For 12th night, there were dinners and balls, dances. George and I had already decided that we would order our clothing for the ceremony from London. When the clothes arrived, he looked most handsome, but as usual, his clothes were too tight. You see, the best tailors in London didn't quite fit his large size. Now, the reception we had at White House Plantation, we served meats, desserts, wines, and ales, and our guests danced until late into the evening and stayed for several days, as was customary.
Our guest list included some of the most prominent citizens of Virginia. The Royal Governor, Lord Farquhar and his wife were there, as well as members of the legislature, and of course, friends and family from along the banks of the Potomac and Monkey Rivers. I even received a letter from congratulations from my regiment, the Virginia regiment that I had commanded. They congratulated me on my retirement, as well as my marriage. After we wed, we continued to live at our White House plantation for about 3 months. You understand, renovations weren't complete at our home yet, and the only time we left White House was to go into Williamsburg on official business. Once we got word that the renovations were completed, we boarded our carriage with our 2 small children, Jackie, who's age 4, and Patsy, age 2, along with 12 household servants, and made our way to our new home, Mount Vernon.
In the beginning, we did have deep discussions about where we were going to live. I really wanted to stay at White House Plantation. It was near my family and friends. And the home at White House Plantation was much bigger than the one at Mount Vernon at the time. And Mount Vernon was in the middle of the frontier. The closest town was Alexandria, and it was a little more than a ferry stop. but I knew George had elaborate plans for Mount Vernon, and I really did want to make a fresh start with my new husband. I knew we would enjoy making those plans together. I knew he was a hard worker, a tough colonel in the Virginia Regiment, and a competent surveyor. I also learned early on that we both shared a love for the finer things in life. And I also learned he was a flashy dresser, often the best dressed man in the room. Now, my taste for clothing was for elegance, yet in simplicity.
I was very much looking forward to our first anniversary, January 6th of 1760. I was making plans, and I had to put them aside as an epidemic of the measles swept through our entire region, and my Patsy got a severe case of it. I was consumed about her recovery for a long time, even though I had a good doctor tending to her. Well, she proceeded to recover. We spent the next 16 years in peace and harmony before we started to have any problems with the mother country. And I was learning to call Jackie and Patsy my own. But Jackie could be a real irritant to me when it came to his education. But his mother tended to spoil him, indeed. But Jackie saw little or no value in having an education. Well, as for me, I'd sooner have a spoiled child than an unhappy wife, indeed. And then there was our Patsy. As she was growing into a fine young lady, she started having seizures. At age 17, she passed. With her passing, we were in a long and lonely state of mourning. You understand, our best friends, George William and Sally Fairfax, they had moved back to England. They didn't share our concerns about the escalation of problems that we were having here in the colonies with the mother country.
With growing tensions with the mother country, we had very few bright spots. But there was one when our son Jack married Eleanor Calvert of Maryland. This was only months after the death of Patsy. I was still in mourning. We were both pleased with the match, but I didn't go to the ceremony. I didn't feel it was right to attend their special celebration wearing a mourning gown.
With growing tensions with the mother country, the leaders of the colonies, they called for a meeting in Philadelphia of all the colonies, send delegates, and we'll discuss those problems we're having with England. I was chosen to be a representative of my Virginia. It was no time for me in our state of mourning to be leaving home. But as duty called, I went to Philadelphia, became known as the Continental Congress. While there, we proceeded to discuss those taxes they were levying on us and those coercive acts. But likewise, the protests that we were holding here in the colonies, were they detrimental to our cause, or was it something that was going to help us in the long run? Well, regardless, we decided to take a break. I went home to Mount Vernon. Wasn't there long till I heard of another insurrection in the Boston area, this time at Lexington and Concord. They said there was much bloodshed. With that, it wasn't long till we were back in Philadelphia for a second Continental Congress. Once there, it was soon determined we had to have a Continental Army.
With my George as Commander-in-Chief, I held my breath. I actually literally held my breath as I read his letter that he wrote to me on the way to Cambridge that he had been appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Now, the separation was almost unbearable, not only for me, but also for George. He was consumed with worry as Lord Dunmore was sailing up and down the Potomac and threatening Mount Vernon. So once he got to Cambridge and settled in, he wrote to me and asked me to join him. This was unheard of, never been done before, but I was so worried about this whole situation that I immediately made my plans to make that long journey to Cambridge, to the first winter encampment. I would actually make the trip 7 more times because I went to every winter encampment.
After 6 long years of war, I finally got home to my Mount Vernon the only time, along with the French by my side. When the mansion house door opened, I saw that my son Jack and his family were there. And he proceeded to tell me that he wanted to march off with the army. You know where we were going, to Yorktown with battle at Lord Cornwallis, who had the British troops there. Well, this would have been against the wishes of his mother and his wife, I understand. But regardless, we headed out of Mount Vernon to Yorktown. We dug in our defenses, started to bombard the city with our cannons. The white flag of surrender eventually went up. Huzzah, a great thing. There was much joy throughout the land. But there was no joy in the Custis and Washington family. You see, Jack contracted camp fever, and within 2 weeks, just shy of his 27th birthday, he passed. We were both devastated. I had to oversee his funeral, then head directly to New York to rejoin my troops that were keeping watch while the British held the city. But we were waiting to hear from agents that were working on terms of the treaty in France. You know, it still took 2 long years before they came up with the Treaty of Paris, 1783. We got our own prize, our independence, if you will, indeed. Well, with that, the British set sail out of New York, and we triumphantly retook the city. I met with my officers one last time at Cron's Tavern. There I gave my farewell address to them. Then it was onto a barge, headed south to Annapolis. That's where Congress was now seated. At that time, I surrendered my commission as the Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. And I could finally return home to my vine and fig as a private citizen and country squire. I got home, it was Christmas Eve, 1783. Martha and I were both very relieved to be at home together at this time. Now we could start working on our second family, as well as getting the 5 farms at Mount Vernon back into a profitable situation.
Well, our daughter-in-law Nellie and her 4 children were still living with us at Mount Vernon at that time. She actually lived with us until she remarried. Then she asked George and I if we would raise her 2 youngest children, George Washington Parke Custis, we called him Little Wash, and Eleanor Parke Custis, we called her Nellie, and that was very common for the day, and it was wonderful having grandchildren in our home. Our lives actually began to settle down a bit as we began to educate the children. George remained very interested in how our new government was working, and he was quite aware of the dysfunction. I mean, after he resigned as Commander-in-Chief, he subscribed to 10 weekly newspapers, and he was constantly inviting governors and legislators to Mount Vernon just to stay informed.
It was becoming obvious that something had to be done to strengthen Congress as they were trying to work on your first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. The leadership called for all the states to send delegates to Philadelphia so we could discuss possibly revising the Articles. I was chosen to be a delegate from my Virginia. I reluctantly attended. Once there, they made me the presiding officer over the convention, and we soon realized there would be no revising those articles. We had to draw up a new constitution. Well, it took 4 long, hot months in that room in Philadelphia, for sure, before the delegates agreed and sent it on to the states for ratification. Now I could return home to my vine and fig once again. It still took 9 months before the 9th state ratified it to make it the law of the land. And it wasn't long after that, it was April 14th, 1789, I got a visit from Congress. It was Charles Thompson, the secretary. He was bringing me the news I knew was coming, but wasn't looking forward to. He actually read to me that I had been unanimously elected by the Electoral College to be the first president of the United States. And I must say at that time, I had feelings going off to that chair of government. Not unlike a culprit being led off to his execution.
I didn't get to go to George's first inauguration. It was an overwhelming task to move an entire household from Mount Vernon to New York City. But by May, with my 2 grandchildren, I made my way to New York. When I arrived, I was not very happy. I felt like I was a state prisoner. But we were hard at work trying to establish precedents and a presidential image. Our lives finally settled a bit, and it enabled us to enjoy hosting dinners occasionally for legislators, visitors, and occasionally friends. But our days went so fast. We were busy from sun up to sundown with meetings and entertainment. The problem with this was we had very little privacy. Actually, the only time it seemed that we were ever alone was in the privacy of our own bedchambers. After 2 long terms, we were both just ready to go home.
Yes, we had a smooth and peaceful transition of government with my Vice President John Adams elected the second president, you know. Indeed. I had crated most of our belongings and sent them home to Mount Vernon before we left Philadelphia. I stayed as I was celebrating my 65th birthday and also President Adams' inauguration. Once home, I proceeded to arise before dawn, as I customarily would do, be careful not to awaken my Patsy, and go down to my study. There I got cleaned up, sat at my desk, opened my diary, and that first day I wrote, at home, all day, alone. Then I went out and went on my horse and rode around my 5 farms, inspecting them and talking to the overseers and the managers. December 12th was one of those days. As I went down to the steady, I saw where it snowed outside and been snowing for some time, I guess. So I prepared for it, appropriately dressed, and went out and took on my tour of the 5 farms. I got kind of wet and chilled, I must admit. And then I saw where it was fast approaching the dinner hour. We always eat promptly, dinner, that is, at 3 o'clock. So I galloped my horse back to the mansion house, went in the front door, threw off my cloak, and went and sat at this dinner table. When Martha came out and saw what I looked like, wet and chilled, I suppose, she told me to go and change. We always eat promptly at 3 o'clock, whether we have guests or not. After dinner, I retired to my study and answered some correspondence before going off to my bedchamber. That night, I got a bit of a sore throat. The next morning, down to my study, decided to change my routine. It was still snowing outside. So I just went on to the bowling green, you know, outside our house there, and rode my horse around, marking trees that had to be worked on. And my throat wasn't getting any better, so it was back to the house. That night in my bedchamber, I felt like I was getting a fever. Later on, I told Martha I thought my throat was swelling shut. She wanted to have one of my aides go and get my good friend, the doctor, gone to the mansion house in the middle of the night. I said, no, we'll wait till morning when the servant comes in and lights the fire. In the morning, my personal secretary, Tobias Gear, came in. She told him he had an aide go and get my good friend, Dr. James Gray, in Alexandria. He came to the mansion house. Later on, 2 other doctors came, Dr. Brown and Dr. Dick.
My George died that day, December 14th, 1799. After he saw to it that I had the most recent will, he looked over to Tobias and whispered his will. Tobias was sitting at his bedside. I was sitting close by. I was actually sitting close enough that I could see him take his last breath. I leaned over and asked Tobias if he was gone, and Tobias couldn't answer, he just nodded. I didn't go to George's funeral. I instead watched from a 3rd floor bedroom window as his Masonic brothers were his pallbearers. I made that my bedroom from that point forward because I walked our bedroom chambers and never went there again. We had many family members still living with us at Mount Vernon, and I cared for them as best I could. And we had throngs of visitors stopping by to pay their respects. I hosted them as George would have wanted, but I wasn't in it. Then in late spring, 1802, I was exhausted, very ill. I could barely make it up to the 3rd floor bedroom, and I knew my time was near. So I asked my granddaughter Nellie to find the beautiful gown George had purchased for me during the presidency. She found it and put it across the foot of my bed. I knew there was one more thing I had to do before I joined my life partner. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, I gathered all the letters from over 40 years of marriage. I took them down to the parlor and I burned them. My intent, after living a very public life, was to keep our love private. And I did.
Does anyone have any questions? Please.
Yes, please.